The book of the prophet Ezekiel. Ezekiel was a priest who had been living in Jerusalem during the first Babylonian attack on the city. And they spared the city, but they took a first wave of Israelite prisoners and hauled them off into exile, and Ezekiel was among them. So the book begins 5 years after all that, and Ezekiel is sitting on the bank of an irrigation canal near his Israelite refugee camp, and it's his 30th birthday, no less, the year that he would have been installed as a priest in Jerusalem. And then all of a sudden, Ezekiel has this vision. He sees a storm cloud approaching, and then inside the cloud are 4 strange creatures that have wings outstretched and touching each other. And these creatures each had 4 faces. And then he saw 4 wheels, one by each creature. And then he saw that the wings of the creatures were supporting this dazzling platform. And then on that platform is a throne. And then sitting on that throne is this human-like creature, glowing and shrouded in fire. And then all of a sudden Ezekiel realizes what he's seeing. He calls it the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. It's God riding his royal throne chariot. Now the word glory, in Hebrew it's kavod, it means heavy or significant. The biblical authors use this word to describe the physical appearance and manifestation of God's significance when he shows up in person. These images in the vision, they're very similar to what happened when God appeared on Mount Sinai in the book of Exodus. And it's also very similar to the depictions of God's presence over the Ark of the Covenant. And that's actually the most shocking thing about Ezekiel's vision. What is God's glory doing in Babylon? It's supposed to be above the Ark of the Covenant, in the temple in Jerusalem. And so the first section of the book opens to explore that question as Ezekiel begins to accuse Israel of rebellion. So God first speaks to Ezekiel from the throne chariot, and he commissions him as a prophet. Ezekiel is to accuse Israel of breaking their covenant agreement with God in a couple ways. Israel has given their allegiance to other gods and has been worshiping idols, and this has all led to rampant social injustice and violence. And so as a result, God appoints Ezekiel to warn the people. The first Babylonian attack that took Ezekiel into exile is going to be matched by another, and Jerusalem, its temple, all face imminent destruction.
Ezekiel chapter 2, verses 2 to 5. I send you to rebels. Speak, they will know a prophet came. As he spoke to me, the Spirit entered into me and set me on my feet. And I heard the one who was speaking say to me, Son of man, I am sending you to the Israelites, rebels who have rebelled against me. They and their fathers have revolted against me to this very day. Hard of face and obstinate of heart are they to whom I am sending you. But you shall say to them, Thus says the Lord God. And whether they heed or resist, for they are a rebellious house, they shall know that a prophet has been among them. Here Ezekiel is called to his prophetic mission. He will become God's mouthpiece, his representative to a disobedient nation. When God asked Ezekiel to be his prophet, he also strengthened Ezekiel through the power of the Holy Spirit. The Jewish exiles thought that their stay in Babylon was only a temporary situation before returning to the Promised Land. But they stayed for a longer period of time because they were stubborn and wouldn't admit to or turn from their sinful ways. So they remained in their self-imposed purgatory because they found that in continuing to sin against God was more enjoyable. The temporary benefits of sin won over the eternal consequences of their acts. Ezekiel, like Isaiah and Jeremiah, felt discouraged because the people weren't listening to them. In the business world, many will tell you the measure of success is building wealth by giving the customer what they want for a price. The real measure of a prophet's success is how well he obeyed God, not how well the people responded. Being the older child in the family, your mother tells you to tell the youngest child to take out the trash. Since you are an obedient child, you tell the youngest child that Mom says that you need to bring out the trash. The younger child refused to do what Mom asked. Now ask yourself, did you do what Mom asked? Yes. You told the younger child to take out the trash. Did the younger child do what you asked? No. Who will be punished for non-compliance? The younger child, because they disobeyed. The prophets of old were judged the same way. If they did and said what God asked, they obeyed, and God didn't have a problem with them. However, if the people refused to obey God, they chose to be disobedient and were punished by causing themselves to remain in Babylon until they complied with God's wishes.
Are fixed on the Lord, pleading for His mercy. Our eyes are fixed on the Lord, pleading for His mercy. To you I lift up my eyes, who are enthroned in heaven. As the eyes of servants are on the hands of their masters, our eyes are fixed on the Lord, pleading for His mercy. As the eyes of a maid are on the hands of her mistress, so are our eyes on the Lord our God, till He have pity on us. Our eyes are fixed on the Lord, pleading for His mercy. Have pity on us, O Lord, have pity on us, for we are more than sated with contempt. Our souls are more than sated with the mockery of the arrogant, with the contempt of the proud. Our eyes are fixed on the Lord, pleading for His mercy.
Psalm 123, verses 1 to 4. Our eyes are fixed on the Lord, pleading for His mercy. A song of ascents. To you I raise my eyes, to you enthroned in heaven. Yes, like the eyes of servants on the hands of their masters, like the eyes of a maid on the hand of her mistress. So our eyes are on the Lord our God, till we are shown favor. Show us favor, Lord, show us favor, for we have our fill of contempt. Our souls are more than sated with mockery from the insolent, with contempt from the arrogant. A specific group of psalms are known as the Songs of Ascent. Psalms 120 to 134 were sung by pilgrims on their way up the mountain to Jerusalem. It has been said, I have found that if I look inward, I'll be depressed. If I look outward, I'll be depressed. But if I look up and fix my eyes on the Lord, I'll be strengthened. The psalmist makes this psalm of sorrow for the exiled Jews ridiculed by others for their perceived weakness and poverty. The Jews, God's servants, need to keep their eyes fixed on the grace and mercy that has and will come from God. But why should the Lord show His mercy on Israel? At the time of this writing, the world viewed Israel and their God as weak. If Israel was God's chosen people, and Israel's God is all-powerful and faithful, then why doesn't He act to save His people as He had promised? Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 to 3. Now the Lord said to Abram, Go from your country, and your kindred, and your father's house, to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you, and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. The Jews, God's servants, need to keep their eyes fixed on the grace and mercy that has and will come from God. But why should the Lord show His mercy on Israel? If Israel is considered to be the lowest of all nations, then their shame is reason enough for their God to fulfill His promises to them. In short, the psalmist is saying, yes, God, we are suffering. Yes, we brought the suffering on ourselves. Now we are conquered people. But it is your honor, your promises that are at stake. Save us by fulfilling the promises that you made to Father Abraham. Israel is like a disobedient child sent to their room for a number of transgressions. At some point, the child recognizes the punishment is due to their transgressions, and only the parent's mercy can release them from their punishment. Because of the punishment, both the child and the Israelites have come to recognize their total dependence on God and their need to comply with God's wishes. Thus, they beg to be released from their punishment or family exile in order to reestablish family unity.
Paul's second letter to the Corinthians. Even though it's called 2nd or 2 Corinthians in our Bibles, there are multiple clues within this letter that it's not the second thing he ever wrote to the church of ancient Corinth. Paul started this Jesus community in Corinth some time ago. On one of his missionary journeys, you can read the story in the book of Acts, chapter 18. And after moving on, Paul got a report that things were not going well there. So he wrote the letter that we call 1 Corinthians to correct these problems. And it appears that many in the church rejected Paul's teaching in that letter and rebelled against his authority. And so we learn in this letter that Paul had followed up in person with what he calls the painful visit. And after that, he sent a letter which he says was written with anguish and tears. And so after all these measures, most, but not all of the Corinthians realized their arrogance and they apologized to Paul. They wanted to reconcile. And so Paul wrote this letter to assure them of his love and commitment. The letter's been designed with 3 main sections, each addressing a distinct topic. So Paul first finalizes his reconciliation with the Corinthians. Then in chapters 8 and 9, he addresses the topic of forgotten generosity. And in the final chapters, Paul challenges the remaining Corinthians who still reject him. Let's dive in and you'll see how it all works. So Paul opens up by thanking the God of all mercy and comfort, who brought peace and encouragement to him and the Corinthians during this time of division and dispute. He acknowledges that things have been tense since this painful visit, and he makes clear he's forgiven them. He wants an open and honest relationship. But why had they rejected Paul in the first place? Well, we discover later in this letter that the Corinthians had disregarded Paul as a leader. He was poor, he earned a meager living through manual labor, he was under constant persecution and suffering, he was often homeless, and to top it off, he wasn't a very impressive public speaker. And so once the Corinthians were exposed to other, more wealthy, impressive Christian leaders, they started to think less of Paul. They were actually ashamed of him. So Paul responds first by showing that their elevation of these leaders, simply because of their wealth and eloquence, is a betrayal of Jesus. It shows a totally distorted value system. True Christian leadership, Paul says, is not about status or self-promotion. Paul depicts himself and the other apostles as captive slaves to King Jesus, who's leading them on a procession of triumph. Paul's job isn't to be impressive, but rather to point people to the one who is Jesus. He then alludes to the recent demand of the Corinthians that he provide some letters of recommendation to prove his authority and credentials. And this is ridiculous to Paul. Their church wouldn't even exist if he hadn't started it. And so he says they are his proof of genuine leadership. They are his letter of recommendation. He cleverly quotes from the prophets Jeremiah and Ezekiel, saying that God's Spirit has written his letter of recommendation on their hearts as his new covenant people. The Corinthians shouldn't need any more proof than that. Now, the mention of the new covenant, it leads Paul into a long comparison between the old covenant between God and Israel that was mediated by Moses and the new covenant between God and the Corinthians mediated by Jesus and the Spirit. The old covenant made at Mount Sinai, it was truly glorious. It made Moses himself shine with God's glory, but that glory eventually faded. Not to mention the fact that the laws of that covenant were ineffective at truly transforming Israel. But the new covenant, by comparison, is even more glorious because the resurrected Jesus is the very glory of God and he lives on forever. And it's his spirit that's now transforming people to become more faithful, just like Jesus himself. Now, this all sounds amazing. I mean, who doesn't want to share in God's own glory? But Paul goes on to show how the paradox of the cross turns upside down the Corinthians' ideas of glory and success. After all, Jesus' glorious exaltation as king took place through his suffering, execution, and death. On the cross, Jesus revealed God's salvation. He died for the sins of the world to reconcile people to God. But the cross does even more. It reveals God's character. He's a being of utter self-giving, suffering love that seeks the well-being of others. The cross also reveals a new cruciform way of life. And Paul's goal is that his life and ministry imitates the cross. So although his apostolic career has been marked by humility, suffering, by poverty, it was all to serve the Corinthians. And so when they disapprove of Paul's poverty and suffering, they disapprove of Jesus too. Paul's way of life and leadership is actually the proof that he authentically represents the crucified and risen Jesus. Paul really wants to reconcile with the Corinthians, but he won't let things lie until they've been transformed and embrace this upside-down paradox of the cross. After this passionate appeal, Paul moves on to address the topic of forgotten generosity. So the Jewish Christians back in Jerusalem, they had fallen into poverty due to a famine. And Paul was raising money among the new churches that he started, full of mostly non-Jews. They would all send a relief gift as a symbol of their unity in the Messiah, Jesus. And so many of his churches, they were thrilled to give. But the Corinthians, in the midst of all this conflict with Paul, hadn't saved up for the gift. And for Paul, this isn't just about money. It's another sign that the Corinthians have not been transformed by the gospel about Jesus, which, at its heart, is a story of generosity. Paul says, "You know the generous grace of our Lord Jesus the Messiah, that even though he was rich, for your sake he became poor, so that through his poverty you might become rich." He's telling the story of the gospel through financial metaphors. Jesus gave up his glorious honor, or wealth, and he lowered himself to die like a poor slave, so that other people who are impoverished through sin and death can be exalted and become wealthy through the riches of God's grace. To be a Christian is to let this story sink deep into your mind and heart, letting it transform you into someone who's more generous, more willing to share your life and resources to help others. In the final section of the letter, Paul focuses on the main source of his conflict with the Corinthians, that group of impressive leaders that he sarcastically calls super apostles. So they came to Corinth promoting themselves and bad-mouthing Paul as a poor, unsuccessful leader. And at the risk of sounding self-promoting, Paul says, do these guys really want to compare credentials? He can totally take them on. Are they Jewish Bible experts? Well, so is Paul. He was a Pharisee, for goodness sakes. He has the whole Bible memorized. Do they want to brag about their superior knowledge of Jesus? Paul has actually seen and hung out with the risen Jesus. He's actually had visions of Jesus' heavenly throne room. But more importantly, Paul has given his entire life to the mission of Jesus. He sacrificed comfort and stability, and he never asked the Corinthians for money. Unlike the super apostles who charged a lot, Paul earned his own living. But, Paul says, he refuses to brag about these accomplishments because these aren't the things that really matter as a Christian. Instead, what he'll brag about is how flawed and how weak he is, because it's in those inadequacies that he discovers the love and mercy of Jesus. Or as Jesus once told Paul, "My grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect through weakness."
Hey, Truth Songs family, this is Xander. I hope everyone watching is having a great day today. Just wanted to share a new truth song with you from 2 Corinthians 12, verse 9, which reads, "He said to me, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses so that Christ's power may rest on me." Hope you enjoy this song today. I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses.
I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me, so that Christ's power may rest on me, so that Christ's power may rest on me. 'Cause he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, my power is made perfect in weakness. My grace is sufficient for you, my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me, so that Christ's power may rest on me, so that Christ's power may rest on me. 'Cause he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, my power is made perfect in weakness. My grace is sufficient for you, my power is made perfect in weakness. So that Christ's power may rest on me, so that Christ's power may rest on me, so that Christ's power may rest on me. 'Cause he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, my power is made perfect in weakness. My grace is sufficient for you, my power is made perfect in weakness. Thanks for watching.
2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 7 to 10. My grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. Because of the abundance of the revelations, therefore, that I might not become too elated, a thorn in the flesh was given to me, an angel of Satan, to beat me, to keep me from being too elated. 3 times I begged the Lord about this, that it might leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is made perfect in weakness. I will rather boast most gladly of my weakness, in order that the power of Christ may dwell with me. Therefore, I am content with weakness, insults, hardships, persecutions, and constraints for the sake of Christ. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Pride is an ugly thing, but God continually balances our pride and humility through the thorns that come into our lives. Paul was no exception. If we accumulate many blessings, we tend to become proud and lose sight of Him who gave us those blessings. In this reading, we hear Paul speak about a thorn which came into his life because he was overjoyed. As we journey through life, we too will have suffering simply because we are human, and our bodies have limitations and deteriorate over time. We have family members who, at one time, delighted us, and now they break our hearts. Sometimes we bring suffering upon ourselves because we are thoughtless and or disobedient to God's laws. It is a wise father who releases his children to the consequences of their sin. Suffering is a tool God uses to build character. Romans chapter 5, verses 1 to 5. When we walk along mountain rivers, we notice sharp rocks and waterfalls, which are similar to the problems of life. But as we walk along the lower parts of the river, we find polished rocks, where the waters of life have been allowed to flow over them. Paul recognized that the thorn was delivered by a messenger of Satan, but it was God who allowed the messenger to deliver the thorn. Paul had asked the Lord to take the adversity away from him, but the Lord didn't. Why? Because thorns which come into our lives are gifts God has given us for a purpose. We often don't immediately see the purpose, but there is one which we must accept in faith. Paul had accepted the gift of the thorn with a submissive attitude. Being submissive to God while living in adversity isn't easy. The wayward child may bring pain into your life, but God's purpose may be to teach you how to love more in the face of adversity.
The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for he sent me to bring glad tidings to the poor. Alleluia, alleluia, alleluia.
Jesus departed from there and came to his native place, accompanied by his disciples. When the Sabbath came, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were astonished. They said, "Where did this man get all this? What kind of wisdom has been given to him? What mighty deeds are wrought by his hands? Is he not the carpenter, the son of Mary, and the brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us?" And they took offense at him. Jesus said to them, "A prophet is not without honor, except in his native place and among his own kin and in his own house." So he was not able to perform any mighty deed there, apart from curing a few sick people by laying his hands on them. He was amazed at their lack of faith. The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Well, howdy, everybody. This is John Michael, and today we continue with this theme that Jesus is not being accepted in his own native place. He says a prophet is not without honor, except for in his own home, in his native place. So again, familiarity breeds contempt. But you'll notice I want to put a little wrinkle on this. In the other gospel that we looked on that really talked about this, they tried to kill him. In Nazareth, they threw him out of town. They tried to cast him off this cliff outside of Nazareth. That didn't happen today. It says he could not work many miracles. Notice it doesn't say he couldn't work any. It says he couldn't work many miracles. So there's a difference. There's a difference. Even when you're rejected, even when your ministry or your life in Christ is being rejected, you still can work miracles. Just not as many as when you're in an environment where people really accept what you're doing. So 2 lessons here today. Again, familiarity breeds contempt. Let's see the extraordinary, even in the ordinary people of our daily life. And then they can work more miracles in our life. And if we are the ones being rejected, let's not just give up. Let's just not, give up on the folks altogether. He couldn't work many miracles there, but he could work some. So there will still be miracles worked even when you're rejected. See, Jesus was rejected on the cross, and because of that, he rose from the dead on the 3rd day. So don't lose your hope. Don't get discouraged.
Don't fall into depression. Don't do it. That's the devil's trick. Stay positive. Focus on the good things. Focus on the glass being half full, not half empty. And let's continue to work the miracles of the Lord. And then the environment just might change. That's my prayer for you guys. I love you. All things are possible with God.
Mark chapter 6, verses 1 to 6. Where did he get all this? No prophet is accepted in his own country. Mark leaves a section on great belief to a section on great disbelief. In chapter 3, verses 20 to 35, we saw Jesus' family thinking that he had gone crazy. In the opening verse of chapter 6, we see his entire hometown of Nazareth thinking the same thing. When the Sabbath came, he began to teach in the synagogue. As Jesus moved from place to place, his reputation had always preceded him. The person in charge of the synagogue would have appreciated the opportunity to have such a well-known speaker lead the Saturday service. Jesus was always willing to speak at the synagogue because it was a gathering place for a large number of people. But the speaking engagement backfired for both Jesus and the leader of the synagogue. The people in the synagogue took offense at him. The people didn't deny his wisdom, his reported mighty works, but the townspeople knew Jesus on a personal basis, and since he was a child. Rather than offering a welcome and expressing community pride, Jesus' townfolk were offended by his presence and his teachings. The people of Nazareth came to the conclusion that their prior knowledge of Jesus was all they needed to know. Even their amazement at the authority and truth of his teaching turned to ridicule. They refused to believe the obvious. As a result, their rejection limited his ministry. So he was not able to perform any mighty deeds there, apart from curing a few sick people by laying his hands on them. As you read the Bible, you will notice that for miracles to take place, faith needs to be part of them. The people of Nazareth thought of Jesus as a carpenter turned traveling preacher, not as the Messiah. Had Jesus performed miracles in Nazareth, the locals would have looked upon him as a kind of magic show done for entertainment rather than a demonstration of God's power taking place in their midst. Remember the old saying, familiarity breeds contempt. Had Jesus resided in Bethlehem and visited Nazareth, the reception would have been very different, because he wouldn't have been someone they knew. The people of Nazareth looked down on Jesus because he was just a local working man. Jesus could have been born into a rich and privileged family, but he chose to be born into an average family and to work in a trade. We must be aware of the temptation to evaluate people based on externals and not by their worth as human beings. We have the power of free choice to either help or hinder the work of Jesus Christ. We can open the door to him, or we can slam it shut in his face. These men slammed the door on Jesus and on themselves as well.
I tell you, people haven't changed a bit, have they? When they think they know you, they really think they get jealous when something good happens, or they think the two things: they either get jealous or they think they know everything about you. And we see that all the time. We hear it in our own society, in our own days. How many times have you heard, "Who does he think he is? Buying that big Cadillac, and he doesn't have two nickels to rub together." Right? You've heard that. You probably maybe even said it. We hear this all the time. We hear people tell about, what on earth who does she think she is? I know her. We hear that, and Jesus gets the same very thing. This gospel talks about that understanding of how people respond. And many times they respond out of jealousy. They respond out of thinking they know what a person is or what's deep inside them. Well, Jesus points that we're wrong in this. If you realize that this gospel comes to us immediately after the last 2 Sundays, and the last 2 Sundays dealt with Jesus being with the women, how he was being touched and touching the women, being unconventional, something that was not expected. We hear this throughout the past 2 weeks, how he has healed, how he has brought people to God, how he has emphasized their faith out of the ordinary. So what does he do? He comes back to his own village and he proceeds to, they've heard about the miracles, they see him preaching, and all of a sudden it dawns on them. Who does he think he is? He's becoming sort of high and mighty. Isn't he just a carpenter? And I'll tell you, a carpenter in those days, if you go to Israel, there's not a whole lot of wood around. So a carpenter wasn't the greatest of jobs. But no, we hear them say, and of course, this gospel sort of emphasizes that Jesus' place, Jesus' understanding, and how we respond, how we are called to respond. There's that section there, and I know you've heard this before. That section, I'm not even going to approach that section where it tells about, don't we know his brothers and sisters? There's always that question about, what? Doesn't he have a whole pile of brothers and sisters? What about Mary? How did that happen? Well, just briefly, in Jesus' time, you lived, when a husband took a wife, he lived not on his own like they do today. Well, some of them do today. They lived in an enclave of your brothers and your nieces and your nephews and your aunt and uncles. They lived in this massive enclave of family. Men on one side, women on the other. And so they all referred to each other as brothers and sisters. So it's very common for them to people say, well, we know that family unit. We know that group over there. Who does he think he is? So we hear that in this passage. It's not a matter of who belongs to who, but it's a matter of some people think they know us. I remember many times people even when I was just being ordained or going into the seminary, I remember people, how they responded. My parents would say, our son, John's going into the seminary. And my mother would always say, yes, and then the always response was, yes, we have a priest in our family too. And I was like, wow, big deal. Sometimes we become jealous. And then also sometimes we think we know other people. I never forget that a couple years ago, I attended a Council of Catholic Women's Convention for the whole area of Orlando, and I gave a little talk, and I had this one woman come up from DeLand up to me, and my hometown is from DeLand. At least I moved there when I was in high school. And she comes up to me and she says, oh, I knew you when you were a little older boy in grade school. I never was in grade school there, but she knew me. And she remembered me being on the altar as an older boy. Not there I wasn't. But she thought she knew me. And so how we all think that sometimes we know other people. The message of this gospel is not all about that, though. It's a reminder to us of how we should respond to other people, not putting our own images and own ideas in. It is a message about prophets. If you notice, the first reading was about a prophet, Ezekiel. He lived at 600 years before Jesus even was born. He lived at the time at the beginning and during the time and almost near the end of the exile to Babylon. And he warns the people. We hear about the understanding of being in the New Testament reading today, the understanding of how we should expect and do what God's response is, seeing God's presence in our lives. And we hear Jesus standing in this gospel saying to us what a prophet is. You know, there's two types of things that a prophet does. The first is, the prophet does is many times he'd predict the future. He'd tell people what's coming. But the most important part of a prophet's job was always to lead people to God, to teach them to correct their ways. Who was the greatest prophet before Jesus? John the Baptist. Repent and believe. The emphasis of Jesus' stories and his message is always repent and believe in the gospel, the good news of God. Change your lives. Make something different. How come we don't hear about prophets nowadays? How come we don't hear about people say, hey, you're a prophet? We very rarely use that word. And in some ways, we have been all called to be a prophet. We've all been called to respond to Christ in the message that he has given us, the message of God's love. We are called to lead others to Christ. That's one of the major reasons of the church. One of the major teachings of the church, that we are called to bring about God's love in our lives, but also to correct others, to help lead others to that understanding. And not to look at them and say, who do you think you are? No, let me guide you. Let me show you the way. And let me learn from you as well. Let me not put my ideas in your head, but let me only put God's ideas. Jesus has given us an example here of how he is out of the ordinary, and that God picks out of the ordinary. We are those out of the ordinary. We have not been named prophets, but we have been named Christians. And in many ways, we turn around and say, yes, there aren't any prophets out there today. We've just named them as ourselves. We are the prophets of the New Testament. We are those Christians that follow Christ.
An actor plays the part of Jesus, and though no actor is worthy of such a role, it has been done so that we may understand and benefit from the life of Jesus.
Then he went out from there and came to his own country, and his disciples followed him. And when the Sabbath had come, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many hearing him were astonished.
Where did this man get these things?
And what wisdom is this which is given to him, that such mighty works are performed by his hands?
Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary, and brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us?
So they were offended at him. But Jesus said to them,
A prophet is not without honor, except in his own country, among his own relatives, and in his own house.
Now he could do no mighty work there, except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and healed them. And he marveled because of their unbelief.
Another area somewhat related to this that I believe that we give power to our families that belongs to Christ alone is the ability to tell us who we are, to give us our sense of self-worth, our sense of self-significance, our value, to give us our identity. Throughout life, anytime we're interacting with anyone, in some way, shape, or form, they're holding up a mirror to us to tell us who we are. People throughout your life, they tell you what you're good at. They tell you what you're bad at. They tell you what they like about you. They tell you what they don't like about you. They communicate value or lack of value to you in the way they interact with you. This happens every single day, all day long. And human beings inevitably have to choose who it is in their life that they're going to hand the mirror to and say, this person, I really am choosing to believe whatever it is they reflect back to me. And so these people in your life that you've handed the big mirror to, when they criticize you, it unravels you. When they encourage you, it really can puff you up for a time. They're the ones that you've really entrusted this mirror over to in your life. Now, the place that we give these mirrors out in the greatest measure is our family. Parents do this with kids. Kids do this with parents. Siblings do this with siblings. If you wonder why parents go nutty out on the soccer field and their kids, it's because they have given their kids the power to reflect back to them who they are. They're representing them, their sense of self, their sense of worth, their sense of significance. This happens again and again and again. And the thing that we have to do as Christ followers, and the thing that we have to understand that Christ wants us to do, is He wants us to take the mirrors back that we have invested to others, to send the messages to us about our sense of self, our sense of significance, who we are not, and to give that to God alone. He alone can tell you who you are. It is looking at your Father in heaven is the only one that can give you your sense of worth, your sense of value, your sense of significance, and you have to look to Him alone for that. Whenever a husband is not in the kind of relationship with God where he's standing on his own 2 feet and he's getting a sense of self-worth, his sense of significance from God, he will often begin to look towards his wife to send those messages of his value and his worth and his significance. And oftentimes wives, when they're not in the kind of relationship with God where they're standing on their own 2 feet and they're receiving and they're getting their sense of self-worth and significance in the way that God sees them, they'll begin to look to their husbands to start sending them the message about their worth and their value and their significance. And what is happening in this relationship is the husband's now beginning to put pressure on the wife that she was never intended to hold up, that no human being can bear. And what's happening is the wife is setting a level of expectation and demanding this on the husband to be for her what she needs because she's not getting it from God. And when this begins to happen, the relationship begins to collapse under the pressure, begins to implode. This happens in marital relationships. This happens in friendships. This happens in all kinds of family relationships. Whenever we are not getting our sense of identity from God and who He sees us, we are His loved son. We are His loved daughter. When we are not in that kind of right standing with God, we begin to look to the people in our inner circle and lean into them to tell us and send those messages back to us. And a level of expectation and a level of demandingness gets put on a relationship that human beings were not meant to bear. They weren't meant to be that for you. Some of you have friendships where you feel kind of stifled under the level of expectation, the level of demandingness that is on you. And what's happening is that person is looking to you to send messages that they need to get from God Himself. And when two people come into relationship and they're both standing on 2 feet and they're receiving this sense of wholeness and self from God, love can be passed freely back and forth without the level of expectation and demandingness on it. Now, something that's very interesting that happens is when one person in a relationship enmeshed like this begins to look to God to get their sense of worth and their sense of identity and their sense of self-significance and all of that, and the other person is not doing that yet, well, what happens is this person might have been finding their sense of worth by being needed by this person. And now this person's suddenly becoming healthy and they don't need them quite as much. And this causes this person to react, to want them to come back down here and be needy again, because this is this funky kind of dynamic that happens. But what you need to understand is that when you begin to walk in a relationship with God and you find your sense of self and identity from Him, and this other relationship starts to do this, you have to allow that to happen, because then eventually this person is forced to begin to look to God to be God to them and not look to you to provide a sense of the messages that God alone can provide. We cannot entrust over to our families even the mirrors that tell us who we are. It's not that God can't speak through people, that he absolutely does. In fact, we have to learn that. That's a lesson for a whole other day. But the point is that we're looking to God himself to be the one to tell us who we are.
God's way, not our way. Sometimes it takes a while to understand. As I stood looking through the nursery window at our first son, I just accepted the fact of a normal birth and child. 7 days later, God would remind us that we shouldn't be so accepting, but grateful for his gifts. A week later, Danny developed what we thought was a cold. Betty, my wife, brought him to the doctor because he was having trouble breathing. The doctor ran some tests and discovered Danny had more than a cold. He had spinal meningitis. It was 1968, and most people with meningitis died. On Friday, December the 13th, 1968, we received a call to come to the hospital because the doctor wanted to speak with us. When we arrived, he told us that Danny would die within the next 3 hours. Just then, the door opened and a girl not much older than us came in. The doctor introduced her as Dr. Beverly Kern. Dr. Kern offered us some hope. If we were willing to sign the papers for an experimental treatment, Danny might live, but if he did, he might live as a vegetable for the rest of his life. The new antibiotics she would use might cause brain damage because of the high dosage. We signed the papers. Betty didn't want to sit with Danny. Instead, she wanted to go to church and pray. I was filled with anger that God would do such a thing to an innocent baby, especially mine. We began a trip on an emotional roller coaster that would last for 3 weeks. Danny's condition would improve, then deteriorate, and then would improve again. One night while laying in bed, I said to Betty, I wish God would make up his mind because I can't take this emotional roller coaster anymore. God heard the prayer, and I knew I had come to accept his way as the only way. Danny was released from the hospital in January 1969 and seemed fine, but again, none of the doctors thought he would graduate from college with a double major as he did in 1992. The lessons we learned. God does everything for a purpose. Our family was changed for the better because we knew with God's help we could live through any evil that would confront us in the years to come. God had sent Dr. Kern to us. Dr. Kern's first patient was Danny on her first day at the hospital, and she brought with her a cure and an antibiotic that no one else had heard of. God had showed us that out of evil comes a greater good, a good that helped my wife and I grow emotionally, but more importantly, spiritually. Submission to God's will is the Christian way of life. God had taught us his way. The divine way has a purpose which far exceeds our human understanding.
Once again, good morning, everyone. A Monsignor and a bishop were talking after a Mass, and the bishop says to Monsignor, "So, how was the homily?" He said it was short. He said, "Yes, but at least," the bishop says, "at least it wasn't tiresome." And the Monsignor said, "Well, yeah, it was that too." We get that same feeling sometimes when we are being told something that we don't want to hear. And you have to wonder, why would God even send Ezekiel to a people he knew was not going to listen? Why would you do that? Why bother? It's because God loves his people so much. His love is so extravagant. He is going to pour it out on us constantly. And eventually, some of us might actually listen. And he tells Ezekiel, don't just go to the people who are holy. Don't go to the people who come into the temple. Go to all of the people. Go to the people who may not be receptive to this message. Give it to them anyway. God has something to tell us. He loves us, and he wants us to be with him no matter what. That's why he sent Ezekiel. He knew there were going to be people that just went, I don't want to hear it. Wah, wah, wah. Right? We get the same thing. Jesus got the same thing. You see, in the Old Testament, God sent prophets. Okay? In the New Testament, he sent his son. And look how well we listened to him. It's said in the gospel this morning. He went into his own hometown. You would think there would be this great welcoming, our hometown boy has come back. And what did he get? Oh, we know who you are. You're the son of Mary, the carpenter's son. We know your sisters and brothers, which were actually cousins. We know all about you. And it's really hard sometimes for a prophet in his own home to do any kind of good. As it said in the gospel, he couldn't do anything because there was a lack of faith. And we are all called to be prophets. In our day and age, we're all called to be prophets, and it's hard to do. I know when I talk to my brother's kind of like, look, I grew up with you. I know what kind of insert word here you are. So don't talk to me. And I have to continue to show him that I'm not that same person, that there has been a conversion, that there has been a change in my life. By the way, that I live my life. We all do the same thing. Our beloved St. Paul, in our second reading today, he has a problem. He has that thorn in his side. And 3 times he asks the Lord to remove it. And what does the Lord say to him each time? Don't worry about it. My grace is enough for you. And we all have our thorns in our sides, don't we? Whether it is a child who has wandered away from the church, a sickness that we have to deal with, a neighbor that just doesn't give us the time of day, whatever it is, we all have our little thorns in our sides. Maybe we are trying to talk to a family member who has left the church and they don't want to hear it. We continue to do that anyway. And as St. Paul said to us, we are powerful, the most powerful, when we acknowledge that we are weak. It sounds weird, but the fact of the matter is, when we acknowledge the fact that we are not all that in a bag of chips, then God can work with us. But we like to think that we can do it on our own. We like to think that we can do it all by ourselves, and we can't, and it doesn't work, and we have to acknowledge that. Acknowledge our weakness. Now, St. Paul was telling us, I have something. I have a problem that I want you to remove. And we don't know what it was. There was a lot of speculation. It could be the fact that he had a speech impediment, which I can understand because you've seen me get tongue-tied sometimes, and it's very embarrassing. Oh, well, I have to deal with it. Maybe it was the fact that St. Paul had a very caustic temper. Some of you who know me understand that also. It's one of those things that I have to work on. I can go off like a Roman candle on the 4th of July. I try not to. But it's things like that that we all have in our lives. See, we don't want our saints to have any problems. We want them to be perfect. We want to make them into these perfect little glow-in-the-dark statues of perfection. And they're not. Read any of the lives of any of the saints, especially our beloved St. Paul. They all had something they had to deal with. They all had, as we all have, a thorn in our side. And sometimes because of that, because of our own sinfulness, whatever it is, we say, I can't do this because I am whatever. Same way St. Paul wondered sometimes why he was knocked off his horse and then told, go preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. He says, I'm not good enough. I'm not good enough. And Jesus is saying, yes, you are good enough. And when you acknowledge the fact that you are weak, then I'm going to make you strong. I'm going to give you absolutely everything you need to preach my birth, life, death, and resurrection for your sinfulness. You can do it. You are called to be modern-day prophets. We are all called to be saints. In spite of ourselves, we all have what is needed to proclaim the message of Christ. But quite often we say, oh, I'm not good enough. I'm a sinner. Well, look at St. Paul. Look at St. Augustine. Look at any of the saints. They all had their sinfulness, and they all were called to be holy. They were all called to conversion, and they were all called to be prophets in their time. We've had plenty of prophets throughout the history of our nation. The founding fathers were prophets in a way, right? We had Martin Luther King was a prophet in his own way. We had St. John Paul II. And we have a lot of people who tell us what it is we need to hear, but because we don't like that message, we get obstinate. I don't want to listen to that. Church teaching on marriage, on abortion, on premarital sex. Name something. People don't like it. It's not convenient. It's not what society says we're supposed to be doing. We have to go along with everybody. No, we don't. We are taught what these things mean. We know from our scriptures, we know from church teaching what the truth is, and we have to be able to say, no, that's wrong. I'm sorry. We can't follow that. And yet some of us are going to be very timid. I can't get into a political argument or a religious argument. You know, my father always said two things you never discuss, religion and politics. Guess what? We have to discuss them. We have to let people know that what's going on today is not correct. And we can't and won't follow it. And that means we're going to have some troubles in our lives. You know, people will disagree with us. Our opinion is not popular opinion. Aw, too bad. Our opinion isn't really an opinion. It's the teaching of the church. You know, we have to continue to stand up for what we know is correct. We have to let others know that just because society says it's so does not make it right. As we have the commitment of Christ renewed for us on this altar today, He told us, I will be with you for the ages. When He comes and is present to us on this altar today and renews His commitment to us, we too have to renew our commitment to Him. We have to remember that we need to stand up for the truth. We need to profess the truth of Jesus Christ. Not just to the people who are willing to hear it, but the ones who may not want to hear it. And I don't mean we have to beat them over the head with anything. We explain it the way we live our lives. We explain it the way we talk with one another. We explain it by loving these people just as God continues to lavish His love upon each and every one of us. We have to do the same, especially with the people who don't agree with us. as He renews His commitment to us, today we need to renew our commitment to Him. We have to decide, are we going to say, oh, I'm a sinner, I can't do it, I can't say anything? Or are we going to say, with God's help, in my weakness, I am made powerful and continue to proclaim Christ crucified and resurrected?
I go before you always. Come, follow me, and I will give you rest. Be not afraid. I go